There are moments in history when the most dangerous conversations do not happen on a battlefield, in a parliament, or in front of cameras. They happen behind closed doors, where power speaks softly and conscience answers back. What took place during a quiet, undisclosed meeting in West Africa was not a diplomatic routine. It was a test of leadership, faith, and moral responsibility. At a time when West Africa is deeply divided between constitutional order and military-led sovereignty, a private encounter unfolded between two men who represent opposing visions of the continent's future. One was President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria, a seasoned statesman and a practicing Sunni Muslim, widely seen as a pillar of regional stability. The other was Captain IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso, a young leader who has become a symbol of resistance against old systems of control, foreign dependency, and inherited silence. What makes this meeting extraordinary is not what was planned, but what changed. As discussions moved beyond security, beyond ECOWAS, beyond Western influence, IBRAHIM Traoré shifted the conversation to something far more uncomfortable: the moral responsibility of a Muslim leader in Africa today. This is not a story about theology. It is a story about power, accountability, and the values that guide nations when no one is watching. Do you believe faith should remain private when leadership affects millions? If you feel that Africa's awakening deserves careful attention, stay with us. This conversation is only beginning. Do you agree with this opening section? I will only continue to task 2 when you confirm. The meeting took place at a moment when West Africa was already under immense strain. Regional trust was fragile. Lines were being drawn not only between governments, but between visions of the future. On one side stood ECOWAS, led in practice by Nigeria, defending constitutional continuity, institutional order, and international partnerships. On the other stood a growing bloc of military-led governments, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, arguing that sovereignty had been diluted, that independence had become conditional, and that old arrangements no longer served their people. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu arrived at this meeting, carrying the full weight of that first vision. As Nigeria's leader, he represented stability, moderation, and continuity. As a Sunni Muslim, he also embodied a form of religious identity that had long coexisted with pluralism and state authority. For many diplomats, Tinubu was the adult in the room, the one expected to restore balance. Captain IBRAHIM Traoré arrived with a very different posture. Young, direct, and shaped by years of insurgency, sanctions, and foreign pressure. He spoke for a Burkina Faso that no longer believed patience would bring justice. In African news coverage, Traoré had already been framed as a disruptor, admired by some, distrusted by others but rarely ignored. The meeting itself was deliberately small. There were no press statements, no joint photographs, no rehearsed talking points. According to internal accounts referenced by African commentators, the initial discussion stayed within expected boundaries: regional security coordination, the future of ECOWAS, and the role of Western governments in shaping economic and military policy across the Sahel. The tone was professional, controlled, even cautious. Then came the shift. Without raising his voice, without accusation, IBRAHIM Traoré redirected the conversation away from strategy and toward conscience. He did not challenge Tinubu's authority as president. He did not question Nigeria's constitutional framework. Instead, he posed a question rooted in responsibility rather than ideology, one that reframed leadership through a moral lens. Traoré asked, in essence, what guiding spirit of Islam a Muslim leader brings into power when governing an African nation under pressure? The room reportedly fell quiet. This was not an attack. There was no suggestion that President Tinubu's faith was illegitimate. There was no denial of Sunni Islam or its traditions. What made the question unsettling was its precision. Traoré was not asking about prayer, doctrine, or personal belief. He was asking whether faith remained merely private, or whether it shaped decisions that affected the poor, the vulnerable, and the direction of an entire continent. For observers familiar with Burkina Faso's recent history, this moment was consistent with Traoré's public posture. Since taking power, he had repeatedly emphasized dignity, accountability, and independence from foreign leverage. Yet this was the first time those themes were carried directly into a religious frame and addressed to a peer who carried enormous influence across West Africa. President Tinubu responded carefully. He reaffirmed that he was a practicing Sunni Muslim, committed to tolerance, balance, and coexistence. He emphasized that Islam, like Christianity, could not be blamed for corruption, violence, or political failure. Those, he argued, were human flaws, not religious ones. Nigeria, he reminded the room, was a multi-faith nation. Governance required neutrality, stability, and restraint. Religious law could not replace constitutional order. From a diplomatic standpoint, the answer was sound. It aligned with Nigeria's long-standing approach. It avoided escalation. It preserved institutional language. But from Traoré's perspective, and from the perspective of many Africans watching quietly from the margins, it did not fully address the question being asked. The exchange revealed a deeper divide than politics alone. It exposed two philosophies of leadership. One viewed faith as a personal compass that must stop at the door of the state. The other viewed faith as an ethical burden that should influence how power is exercised, how inequality is confronted, and how independence is defended. No voices were raised, no accusations followed, yet the air in the room had changed. The conversation had moved beyond policy into something far more enduring, the moral cost of leadership. And it was at this point that the meeting stopped being routine and began to echo far beyond that room, across Burkina Faso, across the Sahel, and into the broader landscape of African news. But this exchange was only the surface of a much deeper reckoning, one that would soon expose uncomfortable truths about faith, power, and responsibility. What followed that exchange was not a debate, but a reckoning, quiet, controlled, and far more unsettling than open confrontation. IBRAHIM Traoré did not interrupt President Tinubu. He did not challenge his sincerity as a Sunni Muslim. Instead, he shifted the focus away from individuals and toward patterns he believed were eroding the moral foundation of leadership across much of the Muslim world in Africa. Traoré spoke carefully. His tone, according to accounts later referenced in Africa news commentary, was neither accusatory nor emotional. It was reflective, almost restrained. He made it clear that he was not criticizing Islam itself, nor attacking believers. What concerned him, he explained, were the distortions that had emerged when religion became entangled with power. He described how Islam, in many political systems, had been reduced to symbolism. Leaders invoked faith during speeches, ceremonies, and crises, yet failed to apply its core ethical demands when governing. Justice, humility, and protection of the weak principles deeply rooted in Islamic tradition were often absent when decisions involved foreign debt, resource extraction, or military cooperation with outside powers. Traoré pointed to the growing silence of religious authorities in the face of injustice. Clerics, he suggested, had become dependent on political favor. They spoke at length about ritual and obedience, but rarely about accountability or social equity. In societies where inequality widened and public trust collapsed, faith no longer served as a moral compass. It had become a shield for authority. The most sensitive moment came when Traoré addressed violence. He did not deny the reality of extremism, nor did he excuse it. Instead, he warned that when people are led through fear, fear of punishment, fear of sin, fear of exclusion rather than understanding and ethics, religion loses its liberating force. In such conditions, belief becomes a tool of control rather than a source of dignity. For a leader of Burkina Faso, a nation scarred by insurgency and foreign intervention, this was not an abstract concern. Traoré spoke of communities abandoned by the state, of young men with no future, of leaders living in comfort, while ordinary people carried the cost of instability. In those moments, he suggested, faith should stand with the vulnerable, not with privilege. President Tinubu listened. He did not respond immediately. There was no visible anger, no public rebuttal. Observers later noted that the Nigerian leader maintained composure, returning to familiar ground, the need for stability, the dangers of ideological governance, and the complexity of leading a diverse nation. His position remained consistent. Religion must guide personal conduct, but the state must remain neutral. Yet the tension was unmistakable. Two visions of responsibility stood facing one another. One emphasized order, continuity, and institutional balance. The other emphasized moral urgency, independence, and the obligation to confront injustice even if it unsettled established systems. Within hours, Fragments of the meeting began circulating quietly among analysts and commentators. No official statements were released, but the implications were clear. This was not merely a disagreement between Burkina Faso and Nigeria. It was a reflection of a broader struggle unfolding across Africa, whether leadership should prioritize stability at all costs, or whether moral clarity demanded risk. For many following African news closely, IBRAHIM Traoré's stance reinforced his image as a leader willing to ask questions others avoided. For others, it raised concerns about idealism and unpredictability. What could not be denied was the emotional weight of the moment. It forced listeners to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, power, and responsibility. And as the meeting drew to a quiet close, one reality lingered. This conversation was never meant to end in that room. Its consequences were only beginning to surface. The consequences of that closed-door exchange did not arrive with headlines or official communiques. They unfolded quietly, through shifts in tone, posture, and public expectation. In Burkina Faso, the implications were felt almost immediately, not through policy announcements, but through perception. IBRAHIM Traoré's remarks reinforced an image that had been forming since his rise to power, a leader who viewed authority not as inheritance, but as obligation. Among ordinary citizens, particularly the young and the economically marginalized, Traoré's stance resonated deeply. In communities long accustomed to seeing leaders speak the language of faith while living far from its ethical demands, his words felt personal. They echoed frustrations rooted in daily life, rising costs, insecurity, foreign dependence, and a sense that national decisions were being shaped elsewhere. For many in Burkina Faso, this was not theology. It was about dignity. Politically, the moment sharpened existing divisions within West Africa. Governments aligned with ECOWAS continued to emphasize legality, constitutional order, and international cooperation. Military-led states, meanwhile, framed their position as corrective rather than destructive. They argued that sovereignty had been hollowed out by decades of conditional aid, security partnerships, and economic frameworks that failed to protect ordinary people. Traoré's critique of religious distortion intersected directly with this argument. By highlighting how faith could be used to legitimize inequality and silence dissent, he implicitly questioned the moral foundations of the existing regional order. This placed pressure not only on Nigeria, but on religious and political elites across the region. Silence, in this context, began to look like complicity. Civil society reactions were mixed. Some religious leaders defended Tinubu's approach, warning against the dangers of merging belief with governance. Others, particularly independent scholars and grassroots organizers, acknowledged the uncomfortable accuracy of Traoré's observations. They noted that when faith loses its role as a moral counterweight to power, societies drift towards cynicism and disengagement. Internationally, the implications were carefully monitored. Western governments did not comment publicly, but analysts recognized the broader significance. This was not merely about Islam or West Africa. It was about the growing demand for leadership models that reject both ideological extremism and transactional governance. In Africa news circles, the exchange was increasingly interpreted as part of a larger realignment, one in which moral legitimacy was becoming as important as legal authority. For IBRAHIM Traoré, the risks were real. Challenging entrenched systems invites isolation. Questioning the moral coherence of leadership invites scrutiny. Critics warned that rhetoric alone could not substitute for policy, and that idealism without institutional safeguards could deepen instability. Supporters countered that stability without justice was already failing. In Nigeria, the response remained measured. President Tinubu's administration avoided engagement with the substance of the exchange, reinforcing its commitment to pluralism and state neutrality. Yet the absence of a rebuttal did not erase the question that had been raised. It merely deferred it. Across the Sahel, among soldiers, students, clerics, and farmers, the conversation continued, often quietly, sometimes uncomfortably. Who should a leader answer to when law, faith, and foreign pressure collide? Can neutrality remain moral when inequality persists? These were not abstract debates. They shaped expectations, loyalties, and the future of political legitimacy in the region. And they set the stage for a broader reckoning, one that would soon extend beyond Burkina Faso and Nigeria into global discussions about power, belief, and independence. From the perspective of the United States and its allies, The exchange between Ibrahim Traoré and President Bola Ahmed Tinubu landed in unfamiliar territory. Washington is accustomed to reading Africa through the lenses of security cooperation, counter-terrorism, democratic procedures, and economic reform. What emerged from this closed-door meeting challenged those categories. It raised a question American policymakers rarely ask aloud: what happens when legitimacy is defined not only by law, but by moral authority? In recent years, U.S. engagement in Africa has leaned heavily on institutional continuity. Stability, predictability, and partnership with established governments have been the guiding principles. Nigeria, under Tinubu, fits that framework. It is constitutional, multi-religious, and aligned with international norms. From a traditional American viewpoint, that makes Nigeria a responsible partner. Burkina Faso does not fit so neatly. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has rejected familiar scripts. It has distanced itself from Western military frameworks, questioned international financial institutions, and spoken openly about sovereignty in moral terms. In much of African news coverage, Traoré is framed either as a dangerous populist or as a courageous reformer. What is often missed is how deliberately he speaks to values rather than ideology. For an American audience, especially viewers over 40 who remember the Cold War, liberation theology, and the moral language once used by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., this moment should feel strangely familiar. Traoré is not arguing for theocracy. He is arguing that power without ethical grounding eventually collapses, no matter how legal it appears. Globally, the meeting exposed a widening gap between Western expectations and African realities. International institutions often emphasize governance metrics, election timelines, and fiscal discipline. Traoré's challenge cuts across that framework. He asks whether those systems actually protect the poor, reduce dependency, or reflect the moral traditions of the societies they govern. For the United States, this creates discomfort. American foreign policy is built on secular governance, yet it frequently partners with leaders whose moral legitimacy is contested at home. When Traoré questions whether faith has been reduced to a symbol while inequality deepens, he indirectly questions the alliances built on that imbalance. This does not mean Washington must endorse Traoré. Skepticism is reasonable. Military governments carry risks. Concentrated power demands accountability. But ignoring the ethical dimension of his message would be a mistake. Across Africa, especially among younger populations, legitimacy is increasingly measured by courage, independence, and moral clarity, not by approval from abroad. In this sense, Ibrahim Traoré represents a broader shift in Burkina Faso and beyond. African news is no longer only about crises and interventions. It is about competing visions of authority. One vision seeks reassurance from international systems. The other seeks validation from the people themselves. For American viewers, the question is not whether Traoré is right in every detail. The question is whether the old assumptions still hold. Can stability endure without justice? Can partnerships survive when moral credibility erodes? And can the United States afford to dismiss voices that speak in ethical terms rather than bureaucratic ones? As the global balance of influence changes, these questions will only grow louder, and they lead directly to an unexpected turn, one that may redefine Ibrahim Traoré's role not just as a national leader, but as a symbol. Up to this point, the meeting between Ibrahim Traoré and President Bola Ahmed Tinubu could still be interpreted as a tense but limited exchange. One leader questioning, the other defending, both remaining within familiar boundaries. But the true turning point did not occur inside that room. It emerged afterward, in how the message traveled, how it was received, and how it quietly altered the balance of moral authority across the region. What surprised many observers was not resistance to Traoré's words, but the silence that followed them. No coordinated rebuttal emerged from regional institutions. No senior religious councils issued firm condemnations. No unified narrative formed to counter the ethical challenge he raised. In politics, silence often signals uncertainty. In this case, it revealed something deeper. The question had landed where defenses were weakest. Across Burkina Faso, the story spread not as a rumor, but as a reflection. People did not repeat the exchange verbatim. They repeated its meaning. In markets, barracks, and classrooms, the conversation was not about Sunni Islam or constitutional theory. It was about whether leadership still carried moral weight. Traoré's image shifted from a military ruler navigating crisis to a figure willing to confront the moral exhaustion of the old order. This was the twist. Power did not shift through force or decree. It shifted through symbolism. In Africa news commentary, analysts began to note a pattern. Ibrahim Traoré was increasingly framed not merely as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a voice articulating what many felt but rarely heard from those in power. His insistence that faith, any faith, must serve justice rather than shield authority, resonated far beyond religious lines. Christians, Muslims, and secular citizens found common ground in the idea that dignity had been sidelined for too long. For regional elites, this posed a dilemma. Challenging Traoré directly risked validating his critique. Ignoring him allowed the narrative to grow. The moral language he employed was difficult to counter without appearing defensive or disconnected from ordinary people's realities. In this way, Traoré altered the terrain. Debate was no longer about legality alone, it was about conscience. Internationally, the shift was equally notable. While governments remained cautious, grassroots attention increased. Independent commentators, particularly within African news networks and diaspora circles, began to treat Traoré less as an anomaly and more as a symbol of a generational break. He was not calling for a new ideology. He was calling for accountability rooted in values many leaders still claim to uphold. This repositioning elevated his stature, not because he demanded it, but because the moment demanded someone willing to articulate what others avoided. In a region fatigued by promises of reform that never arrived, Traoré's willingness to ask uncomfortable questions became a form of leadership in itself. The twist, then, was not triumph, but transformation. Ibrahim Traoré emerged from the exchange with greater moral visibility, even as formal power structures remained unchanged. He did not gain allies through negotiation, he gained attention through clarity. And with that clarity came risk. Symbols invite scrutiny, expectations rise, the burden of living up to one's words grows heavier than any title. Yet for Traoré, this seemed to be the cost he was prepared to bear. In Burkina Faso, the shift was subtle but real. People began to speak less about survival and more about purpose. Whether that momentum could translate into lasting reform remained uncertain. But one thing had changed irrevocably. The conversation about leadership was no longer confined to institutions. It had returned to ethics. That is how a private meeting, meant to remain routine, became a turning point, quietly redefining Ibrahim Traoré not just as a head of state, but as a symbol in the evolving story of Africa. In the end, this story does not conclude with a signed agreement, a public statement, or a clear victor. It ends with something far more enduring, a question that refuses to disappear. In a world where leadership is often measured by power, alliances, and approval, Ibrahim Traoré has forced a different measure into the conversation: moral responsibility. For Burkina Faso, this moment represents more than a political stance. It reflects a longing for renewal for a nation where authority is accountable, where faith is not a shield for privilege, and where independence is more than a slogan. In the wider landscape of African news, it signals a shift in tone. Africa is no longer only asking to be governed, it is asking to be respected. Ibrahim Traoré does not claim perfection, he does not promise miracles. What he offers instead is a challenge to leaders, to institutions, and to history itself. A challenge to remember that power without conscience eventually collapses, and that nations are rebuilt not only with policy, but with courage. As Traoré himself has said, "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to take it." The question now belongs to all of us. Can leadership rooted in ethics still shape the future, or have we grown too comfortable with compromise? If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to you, share this story. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. And continue the conversation because Africa's story is still being written.